Now let's talk about what you need to pay attention to while you are listening to your lecture or to your dialogue in your listening section. What is important? First of all, let's look for the main idea. I will give you an example. For example, you have a lecture and the professor tells you, so today let's talk about monkeys. Blah, 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 blah. Then a student asks a question. All right, what do you want? Excuse me, professor, from the previous lecture about dinosaurs, I didn't really get that thing. All right, so the professor then starts to answer the question, right? And he says, oh yeah, dinosaurs. So the thing about dinosaurs, and they distract. So they move on completely from monkeys to dinosaurs. They talk about dinosaurs for a long time. Students ask more questions. The professor answers. And then at the end of the lecture, they kind of come back to monkeys, right? The professor says, oh, and by the way, the monkeys also have the same thing, blah, 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 blah. So let's say you have this lecture, okay? So the structure of this lecture was a little bit weird. So at the beginning, the professor said that they were going to talk about monkeys, and it was just like one sentence. And then pretty much immediately, the student distracted the professor. The student asked a question about dinosaurs. So the professor got distracted, and the professor pretty much the entire lecture talked about dinosaurs. Then at the very end, they moved back to monkeys. So how do you think, what is the main idea of the passage? Monkeys or dinosaurs? The right answer is monkeys. So the thing that is mentioned at the very beginning of your listening passage, either it's a dialogue or a lecture, is always the main idea. And this is how test makers want to make your life harder, okay? So test makers know that for people for whom English is not the first language, it might be a little difficult to immediately start to understand the listening passage, right? So they start listening and it kind of like the ear starts to, at first, not really getting anything, and then maybe at the end of the second sentence the ear starts to understand, right? So we need some seconds to get used to a natural English speech to start understanding it. So the test makers know about this thing and know about this phenomena, so they really put the most important information in the first sentence, in the very first sentence, and then they make it very difficult to guess what was the first sentence throughout the lecture, right? People get distracted, people go different directions in their speech. So the main idea, which is always in the first sentence, in the very first thing they said, sometimes get just not noticed, and then later you cannot figure out what it was. And you only can listen to the listening passage once. So that is why you have to pay extreme attention at the very first sentence that you hear. This is always the main idea. And don't get confused by everything that happens after, by all these distractions, where they go, what they discuss. It doesn't matter. Always pay attention to the first sentence, because this is where they have the main idea. So the same works for a dialogue. For example, a student comes to a professor and the first thing she says is, "Excuse me, professor, I came to apologize for arriving late to your class today." The professor says, never mind, it's fine. And then the student says, oh, by the way, I have these questions about my presentation, so can we discuss my presentation for a little bit? The professor says, sure, and they go on and they discuss the presentation. So the entire dialogue is devoted to the presentation. Only the very first thing the girl said was, oh, excuse me, I came to apologize for my late arrival to your class. And the professor just said, oh, okay. That's it, right? It was just two sentences that happened at the very beginning of the dialogue. And then the rest of the dialogue is all about the presentation. So then, after you listen to that dialogue, you have a question. And the question is, so why did the student come to see the professor? So you, of course, have the answer choice to discuss the presentation and another answer choice to apologize for arriving late. What do you think is the right answer? To apologize for arriving late. Yeah, that was in the very first sentence, and she said it, I came here to apologize. And then the professor said, okay, it was very easy to solve. And then the rest of it was just their distraction. They distracted to discussing presentation. But even though maybe the student actually wanted to do both things and was more concerned about the presentation and just use the apologize thing just to kind of start the conversation, right? Still, it doesn't matter. If the first thing the student said was, excuse me, sir, I wanted to apologize for arriving late, That means this is why she came. This is the main idea of this listening passage. So again, the test makers want to make your life harder. That's why they know that sometimes you can easily get distracted, you can follow how the speech is going, and you can forget what was at the very beginning. Or you can just not listen to it, because sometimes the first sentences are easily missed. So pay attention to the first sentence. This is a technique that I'm teaching you, which is kind of tricky, right? Because if you don't know it, and if you never took this course, you wouldn't know it, right? You just came to the TOEFL, and it's so easy to make this mistake. For people who weren't preparing for TOEFL, it's very easy to make this mistake because they don't know what would be the main idea then. Presentation or arriving late, I don't know. Like, they both sound the same, right? This presentation actually looks better. But this is a trick. This is how test makers want to trick you. So, but you're smarter now, right? So you're not gonna do what they want you to do. You're gonna answer this question right. Okay, the next one, spot idioms, jokes, and weird phrases. So sometimes a professor makes a joke, or sometimes he says some weird phrase. I don't know, like an idiom or a phrasal verb or something that sounds weird, right? Okay, if you hear it, remember it, because of course there will be a question which asks you, okay, what did it mean? What did the professor want to say? Especially if it's a joke. If you hear that the professor made a joke, or he's like being funny or being silly or something is going on weird, pay attention, because if it's just a boring lecture, blah, 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 he's explaining something, then they're not gonna ask you much about why did he say this or that. But as soon as he makes a joke or says something weird or being silly or funny, they're gonna ask you, what happened there? What happened? So remember the context. You already know there will be a question about it. It's a joke, there will be a question about what was this joke, right? What did he joke about? So remember this context. Like, pay attention, pay a lot of attention, write down what you hear, remember how it happened, because there will be a question, so you can already predict. Two questions now, actually. You can always predict the question of the main idea. It's always the first question. And you can always predict the question about weird phrases or jokes. If you hear them, there will be a question about it. So you will see it during the practice. You will learn how to immediately and easily spot those jokes and idioms. But before that, just remember about it, right? If you hear it, then there will be a question. You will see soon. Okay, pay attention to pauses and intonation. It gives you a lot of information. For example, the lecture is difficult, right? So there are some parts that you didn't quite understand. And then the lecturer makes a pause. It's very important, because why does the lecturer make a pause? I'll give you a secret. Actually, the lecturer, the guy who was recording your listening passage so then you can listen to it on your exam, he was reading the script, right? He had that thing scripted. And the script that he had was actually just a basic reading passage. It was paragraphs, it was topic ideas, right? So there were thesis statements, some topic ideas. So it was well scripted. There wasn't any improvisation, right? It was just a script that they were reading. And it was a well-written text. So that's why when the lecturer makes a pause, it means that there is another paragraph starting. And it means that it's going to be a very important information in the first sentence of that paragraph, okay? So when the lecturer makes a pause, kind of like breathes in, you can hear it. He's like, another advantage, right? And start saying something. And then you know that it is a topic sentence. It's probably the main idea of everything he's going to say for a while until he makes the next pause. So pay attention. As soon as you hear the pause, try to pay as much attention as you can, even more attention that you were paying, because this is the most important information for the following paragraph, okay? So intonation and pauses help you to understand what's going on in the lecture. Professor is a hero, remember. So this is basically about the answer choices. Once you already finished listening to the passage, you move on to the questions, and then in the questions, sometimes the answer choices are pretty silly and funny. So for example, you have a question, why did the professor say this? And then the answer choice is, because the professor is an idiot, right? Because the professor is stupid. Because the professor is not concerned about what the students need. Or let's say because the professor is tired, because the professor is annoyed, because the professor doesn't want to deal with it, right? So if you see some answer choices which are kind of like not very respectful to the professor, right? It's kind of like show the professor in a bad light, even like a little bit, that's a wrong answer. In the TOEFL test, the professor is always a hero. The professor is the best person, a best professor, like the winner of all the awards in teaching and in being a professor. So he is great. He is flawless. There's nothing wrong about the professor, and it can't be. So as soon as you see an answer choice which kind of puts a professor in a bad light, says that he's an idiot or he's stupid, he's like not concerned about the students, it's a wrong answer. You don't even have to think about it, all right? Just cross it out, choose some other answer. This answer is wrong. The professor is always a hero. Okay, so these are the things that you need to pay attention to while you're listening, still listening to your listening passage. So always look for the main idea. It is in the first sentence of your listening. It's the very first thing you'll hear. So pay attention because they might get distracted. So there will be little hints for you later. So pay attention to the very first sentence. This is the answer to the first question. Spot idioms, jokes, and weird phrases because there will be a question about them. So it's better for you to remember the context before you move on to the questions. Pay attention to pauses because when you hear the pause, it means that the lecturer is going next to the next paragraph and it starts with a topic sentence, which is the most important idea of this paragraph. So the pauses really help you to understand where are the main ideas. And then the professor is a hero. So if you see an answer choice which puts a professor in a bad light, it means it's a wrong answer choice. Okay, thanks for watching.